we see the world around us changing so dramatically on such a regular basis, and we are told constantly about how much change is going on and how much we're going to have to work to adapt. And I think there's just this tension that at least I see, and know that I feel in myself of, on the one hand, I want to try to keep up with what's going on and to understand what's happening in the culture around me, and at the same time, like, I want to just stay true and hold firm to who I am at the core, and I want to stay true to like the things that have worked and the things that are comfortable for me. Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And Jonathan, this past week or so, there has been a controversy sweeping the nation regarding one of our nation's most beloved institutions, or depending on who you are, one of their not so beloved institutions that is known and recognized, but is coming under some fire for some changes that they made recently, and that would be Cracker Barrel. So I'm just curious because I think probably just about everybody on our listenership has probably heard of what's going on. And as of today, when we are recording this, which is Friday the 29th, they just released a statement saying, hey, we're going to roll back to the old logo. And we just kind of saw how much discourse and just how much controversy was going on about it and thought, there's some really interesting implications for just our culture and how we are approaching conversations and issues like this. And the fact that this was an issue in the first place. So, Jonathan, I don't know if you have any initial thoughts on just this whole thing.
Well, we used to joke that we have, if you want to know how not to rename a company, we've got some ideas about that. And that anybody's been hanging around for a long time knows the inside story there. Cracker Barrel's going to have a really great story about how not to rebrand a company. But we don't normally talk about current event type stuff. We're not that kind of podcast. But it's kind of personal, David. We're on the road a lot. so we go a lot of places where the Cracker Barrel sign is hanging out. And so it is interesting how much of a nerve it has hit here. And we were talking earlier about, there's all the kind of current hot takes. And this is an interesting one where David and I maybe have our own opinions of it. And they're not quite the same as the hot takes in the moment. And they don't necessarily agree with each other. But David, I'm interested in... there's all kinds of things to be said. There's such a fascinating sort of piece here. There's things to be said from a branding, marketing, business standpoint. Mm-hmm. Obviously, lots of people love to say things from a cultural standpoint. But I'm most intrigued by the fact that why is it that changing the sign on a business, and as far as I know, there was no claim to change the menu or anything else. I mean, I know there was some interior redecoration, all that stuff, but changing the sign and changing the decoration of a business, one of the interesting points for me is why does that elicit such emotional responses? And so, David, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think, in part, you have to take it into the full context of just a trend that we've been seeing over just the past few years of just a lot of different companies are modernizing their logos and redoing their branding. And I've seen a lot of discourse about that, especially with Cracker Barrel, is that there's a lot of companies that have gone from just their more like fun and sort of what's viewed as their like eccentric classic branding that they probably came up with in like the 80s or the 90s perhaps, and they've completely changed it, and it's much more of just like the modern sleek look that you'll see in a lot of logos. So there's a lot of different examples of different companies who have kind of redone some of their branding like this. And so there's one part of that where it's just, I think there is a little bit of just nostalgia to it that I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about, of just like missing, the way that things have always been. And I think it probably particularly hits a nerve with Cracker Barrel because like it's very much viewed as just a staple. It's a very steady, very traditional, like very rustic, it's not a modern place. It's when you think of a store, just a place to go and to eat that is not going to have any sort of modernity, then it's going to be Cracker Barrel. And so I think it just has kind of come to a head there. And I think it just speaks also just to our overall lack of just cultural shift towards distrust of institutions and any sort of change that might happen in institutions. And it's just fascinating that like this has come up in, of all institutions, Cracker Barrel has been the one that's dominated the national conversation over the last week or so. But it really is just at this point, there's so much of a like, if a company is going to like make any sort of change, there is just a very natural, they're doing this just for, because they're, being pressured by, executive shareholders, and there's just a lot of big money decisions behind it. They're not actually doing it because it's what people want. And so people have less and less trust in companies and organizations, no matter whether it's a restaurant or government agency, to actually act on behalf of their best interests. And so I think this is just yet another instance of that frustration coming out, is my initial read on it.
I think it's, from a business marketing standpoint, Cracker Barrel was built. I don't know when Cracker Barrel hit the scene, right? I mean, I don't remember Cracker Barrel when I was a kid, but it seems like early 2000s. David's already doing the research. Early 2000s, it was more of a thing. So when did Cracker Barrel start? I mean,
so it initially was founded in 1969.
Sure, I know it's older that way, but I wonder when it went to become a chain. Like, it was so broad.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Anyhow, the reason I say that is that I suspect that as Cracker Barrel became a chain, it was pointing back to a time that was nostalgic. 1969. General Country Store was starting to wear out a little bit by 1969. If you think, project it 10 years forward, 1979 or 1989, if it's a little bit longer, if they're getting some national play, then all of a sudden it's like they're pointing back to the nostalgic time that's already passed. So just the idea that you would modernize a brand that was built on nostalgia. In other words, it was a brand built on the time that it was before it. It's not like it was built on the time it was in and then it carried forward and needed to be updated. It was started as a brand that looked back. And so I think there's some things there. And I think there's something to the fact that people feel in this rapidly changing world that they want something that they can hold on to and see that it's not changed. And you see the same kind of nostalgia over people being, really broke up about Pizza Huts disappearing, and they harken back to a time in the 80s and 90s when that was such a big deal.
I'm not that upset about that one, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah, but it is interesting. I mean, I have interesting memories from childhood of going to a Pizza Hut, which, believe it or not, was kind of an upgrade from McDonald's. And so if you went there, it was more of a party, it was more of a social thing. And so there is now some nostalgia of remembering that. And I think people want to go back and capture that. And then you see a place like Cracker Barrel was built on that nostalgia, and then they change it and people have this kind of reactions. But there's a broader thing here. David, you're a student of marketing and have your MBA, so you're super smart. And so just looking on a broad take, I think you're right. There's all this trend line of rebranding things. I'm pretty skeptical, unless your brand is objectively ugly. I'm pretty skeptical that rebranding does as much as the people that get paid to rebrand think it does. And so if we think about icons, and so let me name a few and then you get to guess a few as well. So I'm thinking about like business icons and rebranding. And so I would say McDonald's, Burger King, Ford, Chevy, Apple, IBM. There is subtle changes in that branding, but if you look back, pick any period over the time of their kind of predominance, maybe add Chick-fil-A to that. I mean, is there any real market difference from their brand mark now than 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? I don't know. Do you have any to add to that list?
Yeah, I can't think of any. The one interesting one that like I can come up with that's an example of like one of the big ones that did change was, if you remember, like back in the day of the old Google font, when you went to google.com and there was like the sillier font, now they're just like to the cleaner modern font. Is an example of like, even they, a huge company, still are like victim to that. But for the most part, like they're still sticking with the same color scheme. Like you're right, like most of those have stuck with almost the exact same brand.
Yeah, and none of those would be as radical even as a Cracker Barrel change, right? I mean, Google would be, it's almost, the point is that it's so subtle you don't see it. And if you did go back, you might be surprised. I think something like Mountain Dew, right? Like some Mountain Dew has, but if you go back and find like an old, and I know this because when I grew up, there'd be old Mountain Dew bottles occasionally find the woods and alongside the road, stuff like that. And so if you go back to that, it's recognizable. You see the same color scheme and even some echoes of font, but it's a little bit surprising how much it's changed. But the point is it's surprising because they very subtly changed it little by little over a long period of time. Coke probably is interesting. Pepsi,
yes,
I mean,
exactly.
Like
Dr. Pepper, all those.
Right. You look at all this. So are there changes? Yes, but they're pretty subtle. And so what is interesting to me, and this is sounding like a business conversation, But it's interesting from a human nature conversation, and then I want to transition it to something even deeper in that, so what then is driving a Cracker Barrel to change their brand? And now there's all kinds of answers to that, and it's got all kinds of political stuff. But I would go back to something that was apolitical for me. I worked for a college, and there was a big move to rebrand. And if you really pressed into the move to rebrand, it had a lot more to do with the personalities who wanted to put their stamp on the institution than it did a really legitimate, defensible point that this rebranding is going to help us in some fashion. Now, there is definitely rebranding things that can help. I mean, there's objectively ugly brands, or there's brands that need to be changed because the core mission of the company has changed. But if you're talking about a college, which core mission doesn't really change, it's interesting. The college I worked for, if you look back, you can see some radical rebrandings. They all coincide with the dawn of a new president and start about the time they put their whole new administration in place, which means they brought a new VP of marketing. In other words, it's got a lot more to do with the VP of marketing and he or she wanting to put their brand, literal brand, on the company and make a change than anything else. I don't know if you have some of the same observations or have seen the same patterns.
Yeah, it's a unfortunate reality that, it's true. Like it's just so easy in so many business decisions. And I think like this can go into just about any area of life, regardless if you're an executive of an organization that's directing branding or not, just to make it about you and the changes that you want to see and just how you want yourself, your organization, the work that you are doing to be perceived, and to just very easily lose sight of the ultimate mission is just to actually serve the people that you are in business to serve, in the case of a company, or in the case of just like you personally, is to do the job that you're being paid to do, or whatever the case may be, instead of getting caught up in how do I actually just bring out and leave my mark on this. And we just see it very pronounced in the corporate world, but I think it does ultimately point to a deeper human nature issue of we want to feel recognized. We want to feel like we have accomplished something, and we want people to see that and to validate that. And regardless of whether or not it's actually objectively the best thing, especially for these huge companies, we're talking tens of millions of dollars to invest in rebranding, not just the cost of the logo, but then changing every single sign and piece of material that they have to be the new logo. It's a very expensive process. So just the dramatic effect that hubris can have is something worth paying attention to.
I was literally getting ready to say what costs hubris, so I'm glad you used that word as well. Yeah, so there's something important to kind of look into there, because what happens is you have people that are really tight on wanting to rebrand their own thing, and they have a really hard time articulating why exactly precisely it's going to help somebody else. But now you come back to Cracker Barrel, and some of the big criticism is like, so Cracker Barrel is going to be modern. Well, that's an oxymoron, right? This is a modern, fresh look. Well, the whole point was you went to Cracker Barrel because it wasn't a modern, fresh look. We're going to freshen up our inner space. We're going to lighten it up. Well, the whole point was people wanted to go the dark and cluttery thing. I mean, like there was all this, so there is a definite part of like, are you even listening? Do you even know who you serve? And that's a really interesting discussion, and one I think you can get a lot of traction on. But it's not, Cracker Barrel is more of an egregious example of this, but so many other brands do the same thing. And what's intriguing to me is that what is happening when that process takes place is there as a homogenization. There's an assimilation into it. So in other words, when you rebrand and you say, we're going to make this more modern and we're going to make this more fresh, you're basically saying we're going to make this more, we're going to conform. We're going to look more like everybody else. We're going to look more like what people think we're acting. And to me, at the heart of that is a misunderstanding or perhaps a lack of confidence about what it is that you're doing as a brand and as a company. And so in Cracker Barrel's case, we'd say it's a misunderstanding of your customers. But now I want to sort of switch and look into something deeper, because this, of course, is played out publicly with companies, but I think it's played out personally and privately with all of us, right? There's a rebranding of ourselves that we do, the clothes that we wear, right? So if you see somebody, we're just at Apex, and there's several, that's our national conference, and so it's our kickoff event for Ascend, and it's the place where we, meet all of our new students, and we, have our older students come back and alumni and all those kinds of things. And it's interesting, right? At Apex, I'd say, I don't know, David, probably less than in some places, but definitely a majority of students are dressing mostly the same way. But there's a few
Generally.
students who always dress very differently, right?
Yes.
There's a few students who stand out. Now, there can be all kinds of reasons for that, but there's an interesting take there, right? In other words, if you would go back, we've been doing Apex long enough. I know if I go back and look at the older pictures of Apex, they look
Hmm.
like they came from a different time period now, right? I mean, this fashions
Yes.
that kind of shifted and changed, and there's
Hmm.
an assimilation that went through with that. Now, whether that's good or bad in fashion and clothes and stuff, I don't know, right? But on a broader basis, I think is really interesting when it comes to things like faith. What does this mean in terms of practically living out your life? And I see this, David, tremendously in churches. We have to be more relevant. We have to
Hmm.
be more in tune to the culture. We have to have a fresher look. We have to have, and there's all kinds, of course, especially in modern evangelicalism, in non-denominational churches. I think, one of my favorite Babylon Bee headlines is, family wanders around New Mall for 30 minutes before finding the sanctuary and realize they're in a church. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the
Yeah.
idea being that it was so close to everything else that you couldn't tell it was distinct. And so I think the question that is really fascinating to me is Cracker Barrel this interesting mirror that we can hold up to ourselves and say, how much are you attempting to assimilate and become fresh and modern versus being able to recognize what makes you unique? And when I say you, I don't mean you as an individual. I mean you in terms of how you express your faith. I think you in terms of how you understand your relationship with the one who made you. And then, and another thing, like transfer this to your own church. Is your
Hmm.
church willing to hold on to its old brand,
Hmm.
which has never really been popular? I mean, it was extremely unpopular when it was branded initially, like unpopular to the tune of getting fed to the lions unpopular. And it's certainly not super popular now. And there's a darker tone here. We've got another news story happening that's much less fun, Cracker Barrel one, which is the Minnesota shooting at the Catholic
Hmm.
Church. And
Hmm.
you've got this really hue and cry about don't talk to me about thoughts and prayers. And what does that mean? Is that a rebranding? Let's talk about something different. Let's say something new. Now, if we think there's hubris with a Cracker Barrel executive thinking they can change the brand and make it modern, what's the hubris of commentators and politicians who say, "Don't pray to God about this. We need to come up with a new idea"?
Mm.
There's a pretty interesting kind of undercurrent there that is the same flavor as the undercurrent that
Hmm.
runs through these rebranding things. Let's not go to God with this. Let's go to the politicians who clearly have done such a good job to date keeping our families safe and helping in the society and blah blah blah. They clearly have a new modern, sleeker, more simple, updated way to deal with this problem. Don't give me your thoughts and prayers. I'd rather hear some what new flavor politician talk about what exactly is the answer here, which comes back to that kind of heart of hubris that I think is the part that needs to be looked at pretty hard here.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can kind of understand it to some respect. Like it's almost like just the stereotypical vision that you have of the middle-aged man reaching his midlife crisis and going out and suddenly buying a bunch of cool clothes and buying a really nice sports car just so that he can feel quote unquote young again
Right.
because he's reached a point where like he no longer feels young and he doesn't feel like he is as capable or as cool or just like he doesn't feel as good about himself, frankly, is just the root of it. And I think like there's to some extent just like some of that we all run into, whether it's on a company level or on a personal level, that we see the world around us changing so dramatically on such a regular basis, and we are told constantly about how much change is going on and how much we're going to have to work to adapt. And I think there's just this tension that at least I see and know that I feel in myself of, on the one hand, like I want to try to keep up with what's going on and to understand what's happening in the culture around me, and at the same time like I want to just stay true and hold firm to what I actually like, who I am at the core, and I want to stay true to like the things that have worked and the things that are comfortable for me. And I think it's easy to just kind of sway a little bit in a particular direction, and in some of the cases of the companies saying like, oh, we have to completely just move forward and modernize. We have to be able to keep up with the times. We've seen, all the Nokias and, all the call centers, go the wayside just because they weren't willing to keep up with the times. And, that's a reasonable worry. That's something that you shouldn't do in business, is just to let yourself stagnate and, not see changes coming and adapt to them. But at the same time, there is still that element of core identity and core purpose that it feels very easy for us to lose. I think, again, both in a corporate sense and as individuals, in that we are called to understand the world around us. It's good for us to understand what's happening, but that doesn't mean that, like the example that you mentioned with churches is a great example for it, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to look to completely modernize to make our churches look like a mall, to have shows and performances in all of our services. Not that those are necessarily a bad thing, but just like, what is the motivation behind that really and truly to say, this is the way that we are going to effectively accomplish the mission that God has given us to make an impact on the broader culture and, lead people to Christ? Or is this just because we won't need to feel like we are keeping up with the times? And it's something that's worth asking on, not just a business level, but on a church level and on your own personal level, of how am I actually going about living my life? What systems am I using to do that? Do I really need to, adopt a whole new system and a way of going about something just because that's the way everyone else is doing it?
Well, I think your Nokia example is really fascinating, right? So, because there's a trap there, the confusion between product and purpose. So we can think, and maybe it's easier to sort of state from a company standpoint. It's hard to imagine Apple. This is older than some of our listeners, perhaps, but Google had this disastrous Google Glasses thing that they released, right? And kind of like these dorky looking glasses that also sort of invasion of privacy, which probably now wouldn't bother people as much as it did then. But it was a big flaw, and you wouldn't see Apple releasing that, and that would be totally Apple's smart enough not to do that. Not because Apple wouldn't release glasses; they wouldn't release glasses that look like that. Yeah, and so why is it? Well, because Apple knows that at heart they're a design company, and so while they, so the iPhone is a big part of it, and their tablets and all those kinds of things, but there's something about Apple that transcends just their individual product and is more about design. Nokia had this interesting thing where they got confused, right? They produced one product and they thought that was the product, where I would argue Nokia had a bigger sort of essence of being the dependable. You could stomp on it, run it over, drive a truck over it, drop it in the pond, pick it up, and use it, wipe it off type of they were the rugged communication. They didn't have to look as cool as an iPhone, but they would work long after your chintzy little iPhone fell apart and started crying. So it's that kind of thing. And so you see the same thing happen. You can fall down both ways here. You can tell somebody, oh, you have to keep up. You're not keeping up with the times. Well, it is true. If you refuse to change, the world's big enough. There's certainly examples of people that can be sort of frozen in time and still be successful in interesting ways. But most people need to adapt. I didn't use a smartphone. I do use a smartphone. I didn't use this. I do use this. There's new things you have to do. I didn't use social media. I never didn't use the podcast, and now I use podcasts and I produce podcasts and all those kinds of things. There's that adaptability. But if the only thing you're doing is related to that product and not the reason behind, you'll produce terrible podcasts. You'll lose sense of what you're doing. You'll have that midlife crisis. So the guy that has the midlife crisis, he's gotten confused. He thinks his life is about his youth.
Right.
And his youth was just, product's a little strange way to say it, but youth was a phase of his life that means something more. And to miss that is to miss the real point. And I think, from our perspective, the heart of understanding practical Christian living, maybe even the heart of education, is understanding that it's being prepared to do two things simultaneously. Understand how to adapt to changing times, but you can do that because you have a bigger understanding of the things that don't change. We mentioned Apex earlier, and so if those of you are interested, Apex is our national conference for our Ascend program, and you can check that out at beunbound.us. Maybe more importantly right now, if you go to our YouTube channel and look up the Be Unbound YouTube channel, you'll see the first three, at the time we're recording this, the first three releases of our wrap-up videos, which is a great way to get some sense of what Ascend and Unbound is all about and what Apex looks like. And by the way, those wrap-up videos are just they're a whole new level in terms of presentation and videography. And if you're interested in videography at all, you should check
They're
them out.
phenomenally produced, and keep in mind that they are produced the night of
Yeah.
the day that they were filmed doing it. The media team stays up until 4 a.m. making them. I highly recommend it, especially I believe it's the day 2 recap, is using a Wes Anderson vibe to it that I just think is so fun. So yeah, if you're interested in any of that, definitely
Yeah.
go check it out. It's worth looking at.
Watch them thinking two things: just appreciate the videos, and then understand those videos were shot less than 24 hours. Like
Yeah.
the media team takes their last shots at about 11 o'clock at night, and about 9:30 the next morning, they're releasing the video. And that's very close to what you're seeing. There's a few little tweaks that we make before we release them, but for the most part, it's the exact same video. But to go back to Apex, the reason I'm referring to Apex is that this theme that the students chose, and it's important to know the students chose this, was how do you adjust to change in light of an unchanging God? And that idea is central, and it's something that to think about in terms of, Cracker Barrel sort of forgot what was unchanging when they were adjusting. Now, they could do something different. They could say, we're never going to change. We're always going to be exactly the same. Okay, that's probably not a good recipe for being able to be successful either. But they lost sight of the things that were unchanging that's important to their brand, and then changed the things just for the sake of change, which almost always is rooted in hubris and rooted in pride and rooted in narcissism, self-centeredness. And that's true for each of us. In order to avoid the natural pitfalls and sins of pride and hubris and narcissism, we have to look at something outside of ourselves, and you have to look at something that's unchanging. And then we have to, in light of that, to kind of be our anchor, we have to change and adapt to the times as they go forward. And especially now when we live in this time of rapid change. So
Yeah, there's this interesting juxtaposition of like, you have to always keep in mind the things that are unchanging, those core values, those core identity things that will not change throughout that, and then just look at what is changing through the lens of that unchanging thing and say, okay, how can I adapt what I am doing, but based out of still that core foundation? And just always keeping that central piece in mind. And yeah, it's very easy to just drift and focus on one or the other and miss the fact that we have that foundation so that we can build on top of it. And sometimes changes need to be made, but that foundation is meant to always be the same. And yeah, that's a definition of what a foundation is. And as long as the foundation that you have is a solid one, especially those of us who are Christians, I think that we would argue that we have the most solid foundation that you can possibly have when it comes to how to live out your life. Then you are able to take that, and just about any amount of change that can happen in the world can be something that you can take in stride, and you can look at and go, okay, yeah, I might need to change the way I'm going about things and in light of this, but that foundation stays the same, and so I'm still going to maintain that hope. Christians have been doing it for 2,000 years. So I think that we've got a pretty good track record of being able to do that and do that well.
To conclude this, I had an interesting discussion last night. We had a bunch of folks gathered at a house. Every Thursday evening, we host a bunch of folks and some really awesome people, including people like David. And so we were all hanging around. There was a young man there, exceptional young man, asking some really deep and important questions. And he was asking some leadership questions. And we were having a discussion back and forth. And one of the things that I posited in terms of leadership was he was asking, how do you manage the tension between vision and then actually practical kind of work? And one thing that I suggested to him is that as a leader, you have your first, and I think he couched it more in a broader term. What's it mean to be a leader? And we could do a whole segment on this, but to think about that from the beginning, I said, to be a leader is to be ultimately responsible. To be ultimately responsible, you have to have a commitment to something big enough that you're willing to take responsibility for. Mm-hmm. And then I said, but then there's this interesting art where you have to have a commitment to that vision, but you have to have a lack of commitment to exactly what it looks like. Mm-hmm. And he kind of said, what do you mean by that? And what I mean is that, you have to have this bigger overall commitment. I'm going to follow Christ. That's non-negotiable. That's worth every sacrifice. I would even die for it, right? Mm-hmm. But I have a lack of commitment to specifically what that looks like, because Christ might call me to follow him in surprising ways. Mm-hmm. And along the way, there may be revelations. And I need to have this commitment to Christ so I can understand heresy when I hear it. but also have this commitment to Christ. So I understand new teaching, and not new teaching as in it's brand new invented, as in new understanding teaching, new teaching to
Mhm.
me that gives me a depth of understanding of my faith that I didn't have before. And so that tension, being able to hold both things, is kind of the heart of the matter here. And if you're like Cracker Barrel, you maybe, and I don't want to make assertions or certainly not, condemn somebody, but you might have had a leadership here that was willing or unwilling to take responsibility, but certainly didn't have a deep understanding of their greater purpose. And in the process, then lost that thread and took them down some paths that, ultimately I think cost them some money and at least cost them a lot of interest. Well, caused a lot of interesting press. Whether that's going to cost them or not may be determined to be seen. So, well, I hope this was helpful. David, thanks for bringing it up. It was fun to talk about something. I don't know that we're going to get into being a current events podcast, but this was an intriguing overlap. And like I said, as people who are up and down the interstates an awful lot across this grand country of ours, we see a lot of Cracker Barrels. Although, David, I don't know, do you eat a Cracker Barrel a lot?
A lot, I would say no. I've had some good experiences there. I've had some mixed experiences there, but that's just been my opinion.
So any of you who know us, two things will make sense to you. First, when we travel as a team, which is most of our travel, we often have Ellie Smith, who's our director of sales and marketing. And Ellie is a absolutely world-class travel guide when it comes to food. And I don't think Ellie would be caught dead in a Cracker Barrel or any other chain. We're not prejudiced against Cracker Barrel here. It would just be that Ellie's always looking for the authentic local food. And it is always interesting. 99.9% of the time is absolutely fantastic. And the other 0.1% is just really interesting. And then secondly, my wife is not a fan of Cracker Barrel. So actually I have been to Cracker Barrel, but it's not necessarily on a routine stop. But it's one of those things, you drive down the interstate, you see the Cracker Barrel sign with the old logo, and you kind of know what habitat you're getting into. There's a Walmart not too far away.
Yep.
There's probably a couple other chain stores that you can pick
Probably
from.
a Waffle House.
There's a
not
gas
too
station.
far.
Yeah, that's right. Waffle House is probably in the shadow of Uncle Herschel. And so in that sense, it is a bit of an icon that even if you don't eat there a lot, you're looking for that. So, well, we hope this has been helpful to you. If you're interested in what we do, check out beunbound.us. Now, we sometimes end these podcasts with talking a little bit about what's going on in Unbound, and we can certainly do that, but you can go to the website for that. But would like instead to have you hear about Unbound, and specifically about Ascend, from our students. And so following this is going to be a testimony from one of our students, and so you can hear directly from the people who experience it firsthand, what it's like, what changes and what doesn't change in Unbound. So hope you enjoyed that. Until we talk to you next time, be Unbound.
Hi everyone, my name is Abby Huseman, and I just finished my Ascend Foundations year. And looking back on the year, the impact that Ascend has had on me has been amazing. Like, I am not the same person that signed up for Ascend last June. Before I even thought about Ascend, I knew what I wanted to do after high school. I wanted to become a pilot, go to flight school, the whole 9 yards. I started ground school, it went great, and then I started having seizures. And you can't fly if you have seizures, so the Lord closed the door on that. And after that, I felt stuck. I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had no interest that I had loved enough to have a career in, and so I joined Ascend. And it was absolutely amazing. One of the things that really stood out to me this year was something that a speaker said at Base Camp, which is our second live event. And it was just push a button. And that has stuck with me ever since he said that. Essentially, it's try something new. It's okay to fail. You're going to learn from it. Pick yourself back up. It'll be okay. And I used to be so afraid of pushing buttons that I just wouldn't. And I would miss out on so many amazing things in life because I was so afraid. And now, am I still afraid to push buttons? Absolutely. I don't know if that fear is ever going to go away. But I still do it because I know that it's okay if I fail, or maybe I'll love it and it'll be amazing. An instance for that actually happened this year was each student has to complete a personal project in the Ascend year, and mine was to train for and run half marathon. And I started to do that, and then my seizures came back. My doctor said to stop running, so I had to change products entirely. And I decided, well, okay, let's just get my wilderness first responder certification. So I did. And I absolutely loved it. I had no idea that I would love it as much as I did. And so now this fall, I'm going to get my EMT and then I'll possibly go down the route to become a paramedic. And it is just so cool how the Lord you will make your plans, but He will direct your steps and He will take you to where He wants you to go. And Ascend really helped me with that this year. And not only that, but the community is amazing. The friends you will make are fantastic. And I did not regret a single second of joining Ascend at all.